Um, it's about what, 9:02. We'll wait one more minute and then we'll get going. I still thought there were a couple other people that were joining us, but maybe they'll just jump on a little bit late. It's good to see everybody's faces. Some of your faces I haven't seen in quite a while. So it's awesome to, oh, there's someone else. Oh, there's Michelle McKay. So it's, and there's Caitlin. Welcome, Caitlin. It's just so good. Oh, there's Michelle. Michelle's another person I haven't seen in a really long time. Literally some people I haven't seen since January.
Wow, look at all those happy faces. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Okay, there's still a few others that I thought were joining us, but we'll go ahead and get started and then they can.
I'm here, but I haven't been welcomed, but I am here, so FYI.
Hi, Nancy.
Okay,
Hi,
okay,
Nancy.
Cool. All right.
Yes, if I didn't say welcome individually, I apologize. Oops, yep, there's a couple more people jumping on. Good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Happy Shelter in Place Saturday. I'm not sure, is this the 6th Saturday that we've been sheltering? I'm not sure.
Maybe.
Maybe?
Maybe.
It seems like we've been doing this for about a year at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I so appreciate, the city appreciates you being here. And so I just wanted to say a few things to get started and ask for your opinion, and then we'll get rolling. A few of you, actually several of you, were on our call on the 14th. And that was, you know, kind of a touch base, one, just to kind of check in and see how people are doing just in relation to what's going on. We had some good conversation. And also to get a sense of, are people interested in continuing? A sense of things are a lot different today than when we started almost a year ago or 10 months ago. And we discussed that the likelihood of moving or even trying to attempt a revenue measure at this point probably makes no sense. And that seemed to be the general consensus of the group, that, oh, it looks like we have a few extra community members too. But so we kind of, as a smaller group, made a decision that that's probably not where the efforts needed to go of this group, and that there needed to be kind of a discussion of what would the responsibilities of the group be now, what would the goals be? And so before we get into actually looking at where we're at with the budget, how this COVID and the impending recession has changed things, I wanted to check in and see, would you prefer to talk about the CAG's role and goals now, or after we have a little bit of a check-in on the budget?
Well, I would suggest after, since you're asking.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
I agree.
Okay.
Well, I guess I'd like to say one thing, and that is, I do think some of our basic goals of communication, you know, we set up those subgroups, communication and then maybe development will still be important things to have input on.
Yep. Yep, I agree with you. I definitely agree with you. As I was looking over what we set out with in the beginning, I thought the reality is it hasn't really changed. If anything, it's become more urgent, and it may have to be a slightly different focus. But okay, so that sounds good. We will go ahead and get started with a brief presentation of the budget. Christina, our city manager, is going to do that. And I would just encourage you to remember that we really want this to be a conversation. We do have some slides, you know, there's some data there. We have a lot of slides that are mostly just for reference if we need to go back and look at them. You know, we can bring up the budget document if we actually want to look at the document, but we don't want to just run through a bunch of slides and basically do the same presentation that already has been given to the council. We'd rather have a conversation. And I think that's what you're hoping for as well. that this is going to be conversational, give and take. We want to hear your thoughts and ideas. We want to do some brainstorming. And at the end of our time today, you know, we'd really like to have a sense of what your thoughts are. And we can transcribe those ideas and thoughts, send them back so everybody has a chance to review them. And then we're hoping that, you know, that would be something we would actually incorporate when we keep this discussion going at the budget workshop and ultimately, you know, budget adoption. It also, I think, will help to inform our community budget session, which is next Thursday evening, the town hall time at 5:30. So any questions? And we do have the chat feature at the bottom if you want to type in questions, if you want to raise physically a hand, if you want to raise a hand within the meeting. Michelle is helping to kind of pay attention to those things. Hillary Holman is in the background also taking notes. And so if no one has any questions, and I don't think, let's see, I've got two screens.
Maureen, it looks like Nick does. He's physically raising his hand.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out where the hand raiser is.
The physical raise is fine. It's just we've got enough people on here now that I'm
Yeah.
jumping between screens.
No,
so-
no, I understand. I just couldn't find the button quick enough. I don't know, Michelle, is there any way that we could actually connect the chat to individuals outside of just a large group? Sometimes-
You should be able to, if you click chat, you can click an individual person within. So you'll see everyone come up and there's a drop down.
Yeah,
then
it just has your name on it for the drop down. That's it.
For me as well.
Participants can chat with everyone. It
Oh,
gives me the
yeah.
option of no one, host only, or everyone.
Okay, all right, it's all right.
Is there a way we can change that, Michelle?
No, those are the only three options it gives me is everyone, publicly, host only, or no one.
Okay. One of the things also possibly different from some of the Zoom calls that you might be on, you know, because we're all seem to be living in a Zoom world right now. We're really trying to take some steps to make sure that our calls can't get hacked.
Mhm.
And I don't know, Michelle, if that has anything to do with why we're not able to allow participants to chat amongst themselves.
I think it's just a Zoom feature, but I'll keep looking at the settings while the meeting continues. There might be somewhere on the back end I can change that.
Thank you.
Okay, so Christina, do you have the budget presentation up, or
So
are
I'm
you going to share?
share my screen?
Yeah,
right now.
okay.
So can you see the title slide, Engage Morgan Hill Community Advisory Group meeting? Excellent. Okay. So as Maureen said, this is not intended to be a repeat of what we did at the council meeting on Wednesday, which is, you know, we went into depth into each of the different areas. And then the other thing that I did on Wednesday, if you're interested, you can go back and look at the presentation, or I'd be happy to, you know, do this with you individually, is we walk through the budget document because it's pretty large. You know, it's gosh, over 400 pages when you look at the operating budget and the capital budget, but there's a lot of resourceful information in there. Everything from, you know, definition of acronyms to the fund descriptions to our fiscal policies. And so it's a lot more than just numbers in the document. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and just, you know, Maureen or Michelle or Hillary, if we need to stop and you see somebody's hand up, just stop me and I will stop where I'm at. So Maureen, do you want me to run through this agenda page, or did you want to go ahead and do that?
I can do it quickly. Yeah. So we're going to just start off going through the budget. We're going to, what's been recommended. We know in this moment that what has been recommended is not what we're going to end up asking council to adopt, because things are changing daily, and there will be lots of things that are brought forward prior to adoption. Part of what will be brought forward is probably some of the thoughts and ideas that all of you have, as well as the community input. And in the background, city teammates are working hard trying to look at the areas where we can reduce expenditures. We'll talk about how the COVID-19 situation and the impending recession are affecting us. And then we will talk about different ways that potentially we can address these revenue impacts, and then we'll end it up with what you think your role should be now and what opportunities there might be for you the members of the CAG to help in this discussion with the greater community to get thoughts and ideas.
Great, thank you, Maureen. So let's just jump into the budget. So this first slide is just an overview of the 2 fiscal years. And so our next fiscal year, the first year of the adopted budget to come, it starts July 1st. And so that's 2021, and then the following year is 21-22. And so this summarizes our budget both on the operating side as well as the capital improvement program budget. And so you can see the totals of 162 million and 144 million. Biggest difference there is the capital, and that's just the timing of when we receive revenue for the capital projects and when we spend those dollars on projects. This next slide, while has a lot of numbers in it, it's a pretty useful slide, because what it does is it's a picture and a breakdown of all of our different expenditures and our revenues. And so sources and uses, sources is the same as revenues, uses is the same as expenditures. And so you could see the general fund is that first row, and you could see that in our recommended budget, we do have a deficit in that first year, those the two red items, the first and the second year for the general fund. And then you can see rows for each of the different fund categories, and then once again tying down to those total citywide numbers. The far right column is the full-time equivalents, and so you'll see the 193.5. Our next slide will show that same number over time. So here it is. This is the graph you've probably seen before, but the point here for this recommended budget is that we show the number of FTEs flat from the current year that we're in, fiscal year 19-20, and you can also see the bars, which represent our population, showing that our staffing's not keeping pace with our population. We do assume a 2% population growth, and that's based on our 10-year average. This is a pie chart.
Christina?
Yeah.
This is Michelle. Randy Toke is wondering what the enterprise fund is. What is enterprise fund?
Yeah, so enterprise fund for us represents our water and our wastewater funds. Some cities have energy, so that would be another enterprise fund. And so these are funds that really operate like businesses. You charge user fees that are intended to cover the cost of providing that services through user fees. And so for us, water and sewer are our enterprise funds. And I believe we'll delve a little bit more into those. Okay, so on this pie chart, so this shows the breakdown of our expenditures citywide. So all funds for fiscal year 2021, that first year of our budget. You can see the biggest piece of the pie there is project expenditures, followed by salaries, and that really represents salaries and benefits. And then after that, it's supplies and services. So if we jump into the general fund, this chart shows how the revenue is broken down. So 46.2 million in total. For taxes, 61% or 28.2 million, followed by current services, and then our recreation is within the current services revenue. This chart shows our discretionary expenditures, and so of our total expenditures, 28.4 million represents discretionary. And so you can see police and fire there represent 84%. And so what this chart represents is all expenditures for each of these areas, and then we back out any sort of revenue that each of these different areas receive. And this is the net amount, and so this becomes the discretionary expenditures for the general fund. So you can see fire and police are that 84%, and then recreation we receive, we're, cost recovery in many areas, but there are some programs that aren't, and so there is some amount of discretionary expenditures for recreation, and then all those other categories. And you do see a use of fund balance at the very top, so that shows that we are drawing down on our reserves. All right, so jumping into the COVID impacts, and so just high level, our recommended budget that we brought forward does not reflect all of the impacts of COVID-19. It reflects our best estimate at this point in time on the loss of revenues, but we have not yet brought forward all the expenditure reductions that are going to be needed. One in time, we'll have additional reductions for May 15th, which represents our council budget workshop, and then prior to adoption as well. But what are the assumptions that we're making? So first, this assumes, our budget assumes that the shelter in place is lifted at the end of May, and that we phase back in services and programs, because even though the shelter in place may be lifted then, there's still going to be restrictions as to how many people could be in a room and gathered, and so that has very direct impacts on our sales tax, hotel tax, and other categories. So we assume reduced revenues and increased expenditures. And there's some similarities to the Great Recession. So, you know, in our transmittal area, we do some comparison for that. Now, just the question about the shelter in place being lifted, timing wise. So we're of course in close conversation with the county, and they, you know, it's supposed to be lifted. The last day is supposed to be May 3rd. They have not yet come out with updated information, but what they have shared is that there's a lot that needs to be in place in order for the restrictions to be loosened. And so even if there's a change as of May 4th, it's not going to be significantly different than where we're at now. And that's what they told us as of last night. We still continue to have new cases. Convalescent facilities are the biggest area, not as much in Morgan Hill from what we've seen. And there's new deaths. And really what they're looking at, and we talked about this at the town hall, is when a person gets infected, how many people are they infecting? What they're really looking for is for that number to be less than 1, and we're just not there yet. So in looking in totality, this is just a snapshot right now. So, you know, some would say, okay, is this a conservative, you know, realistic? Is it optimistic? Is it pessimistic? It's really just our best case, our best assumption right now. So sort of a not overly optimistic, not overly pessimistic. So all in all, we anticipate a $12.2 million impact. And so you could see the different categories there: property tax, sales tax, recreation, hotel tax, and development services. So if I could just quickly go through each one, we don't anticipate a huge decrease in our property tax the first couple of years. We think, well, one, there's a lag in how we receive our property tax revenue, but also, you know, this isn't an economic slump in and of itself that we're in. It's a pandemic that has caused this sort of economic crisis that we're in. And so if it doesn't last too long and, you know, all things stay constant, what we do anticipate is that the county is going to see more requests for Prop 8 temporary reevaluations, and that's what you see in the 21-22 year. Sales tax is going to be the biggest hit category, and we're obviously seeing a dramatic drop in our sales tax, and what happens as far as the restrictions goes is going to impact this number. Recreation, our facilities are closed. We don't have the rentals of our facilities, and so, you know, this, as I said, assumes, you know, a May shelter in place order being lifted, but restrictions. And so how those restrictions come to be really are going to impact whether or not we're able to open and how we're able to open our facilities. And then hotel tax, so big decrease here. So typically, you know, we were anticipating, I think for this current fiscal year, $3 million. We're going to receive about $1 million less than we anticipated, and we assume that that's going to continue. So next year we would receive $0.6 million less. So all in all, $1.7 million. And then Fund 206, this is our development services fund. So not part of the general fund, but because we're not seeing development to the extent that we usually see it, we are going to see a decrease in this fund, which is going to necessitate a loan from the general fund to cover the deficit. So what have we included in our budget document as far as expenditure reductions to respond to the decrease in revenue? So one is we've closed our recreation facilities. We've implemented a hiring freeze. This applies to non-public safety positions. And so as positions become vacant or are vacant, we are not rushing to get those positions filled. There may be some exceptions if we see certain vacancies, but the general rule is that we do have a hiring freeze for non-public safety. The recreation cost reductions are based on a gradual reopening, you know, as the restrictions come back from the county on what we're able to do. We've taken out some election contract services. And we also assume that we're going to draw down our general liability insurance reserve. It's built up over time. We do have more than our minimum level in our liability insurance reserve that we're going to use for unemployment because we are self-insured, and we're going to see, and we have seen quite a bit more claims. And then some building maintenance projects have been deferred. The one area that we do know on our expenditure side is that PERS costs are going to go up. Now they're seeing a not such a good rate of return, of course, like all funds are seeing. And so we don't anticipate this will impact us until fiscal year 23 and 24. It's about 0.9 million over those 2 years. But this does assume that investment returns start to pick back up and help to partially offset what we're seeing right now. Now, just a reminder on this slide that employees, our teammates, share in the cost of the rising employer costs. So employees will be helping out with the increased pension costs. And then we get to this graph that you're probably pretty familiar with. And so I'll just take a moment to walk through this. So the dashed green line represents where we were in January at our goal setting. We started this year with $18 million in our fund balance or our general fund reserve. That red line represents our minimum balance, our goal for our general fund, which is 25% of revenues. And that blue represents the minimum fund level. And so you can see that green dash line at the time in January was going to hit and go below our 25% reserve mark, but not for quite a while. Now, fast forward to where we are today and looking at the orange line, we anticipate a significant drop such that we would go below the 25% mark during the recommended 2-year window, and we would be at $8.8 million at the end of that window. And so the graph, of course, screams that we need to have additional expenditure reductions to bring our revenue loss in line with our expenditures, and so then the question is, well, what amount can we safely use from our reserves and still be okay, and that's a good question. And and I first respond to that question in that we already are using our reserves, because as you can see, we're going to start using them this year, and we'll be able to somewhat use our reserves, but it's clear that we can't fully rely on our reserves, because if we were to do that, you could see that we basically run out of money by 25, 26. And so we need to make some changes. And so that is what our team is working on and presenting additional budget reductions. This is just a numerical look at the general fund. Some like to see it in the form of numbers rather than a graph. And so you can see, once again, beginning balance of 17.9 million. The top chart is where we're at now. The orange was where we were at the goal setting. And so you can see that we have a deficit for each of our recommended years, the 3.4 million and the 3 million. Now, when we looked at the graph, we saw what was programmed into our budget and what was going to happen by way of our reserves. This chart you've seen before. It used to be a total of 7 million, and so this chart has been updated. So these are the expenditures that have not yet been programmed into our budget. And so these are our unfunded needs. And so I won't go through them in too much detail, but just to remind everybody, police and fire, this is the needs that we have in each of those departments. We have some updated building maintenance and pavement rehab numbers. So Chris Gioni at the last council meeting gave us an infrastructure update. So we have a whole new infrastructure report. And so those numbers are updated, as well as street maintenance. Pavement rehab has significantly been reduced, and our pavement condition index is now at 73. And so we still need to put additional money, 1.1 million each year, towards that, to keep it at that 73. But that was good news, and it does show that the money that we've received through Measure B and SB1 is paying off by way of better roads. And then at the bottom there is that operational loss due to RDCS going away. And so all in all, that $7 million number is now 6, primarily due to pavement rehab. So I mentioned development services, and so basically there's not a whole lot of development going on in town. So basically housing projects can continue as long as there's the affordable portion, and projects that are commercial and industrial in nature can continue if it's to get the projects to a place where they're safe. We also have public works projects that are going on in the right of way, and those are allowed. However, we're going to see a reduction in our revenues. And so in 1920, this current year we're projecting that we're going to need $425,000 from the general fund short term to cover the development services fund. And in 2021, we assume that we're going to see a reduction in revenue. So we're going to need to meet that with an expenditure reduction in the form of part-time temporary staffing contractual services. We are looking at a fee study. We're going to do that as soon as the shelter-in-place order is lifted, and it's going to be a tricky, study, because what we're experiencing now isn't what we were experiencing prior to the shelter-in-place, which is also, of course, going to be different once restrictions start to be lifted. And then 2021 is a pretty substantial number, hence the need for additional budget reductions of $1.5 million from the general fund alone. And then we move into 21-22, which is just shy of $1 million, another projected amount. And then we assume that those loans would be repaid starting in 23 and onward. Okay, so this is now switching gears to the principles that guide the sustainable budget strategy. Maureen sent these out. These sustainable budget strategies are included in the budget document. They have not been updated. These were set years ago. We did talk about them at the council meeting, but they basically go into the different strategies that should be in place as we deal just in some with a regular budget in normal times, but then very helpful in these sort of times where we do have the economic conditions we have. And so Maureen, how do you want to address this section? Do we want to go one by one? Do you want to just give everybody a moment to look through them and to talk about any of them specifically?
One, does anyone have any questions just about the information that Christina has gone through? And I can't see everybody.
John Horner does have his hand up.
Okay, John, you want to ask your question?
Sure. I'm not sure if this is the right moment or later. So if I'm jumping ahead of the game, please tell me. On the slide you have up, I mean, I'm glad this is here. This is very important principles to look at, and the right principles, particularly in time of crisis. And I'll point us all to item D, which actually the other than public safety not replacing anyone is kind of a light version of an across-the-board approach. So that might, bear some more consideration in the information that.
I want to make sure I heard.
Sorry?
So you were talking about D, and you said that across the board, and I missed what you said after that.
Sure, yeah. So this is a across-the-board approach, shouldn't be done. I agree with that. And a hiring freeze is a version. It's probably the lightest version of an across-the-board approach. Other ones are everybody takes a 10% pay cut, these sorts of things. But that's just a little bit in conflict with that principle. So I mean, not a big deal, but something to think about.
Yeah.
To the earlier sorry?
Do you want me to comment on that?
Sure.
This came up at the council meeting, and as when I was walking through the hiring freeze and the definition, that is why I did say that there can be some exceptions. There may be some positions that become vacant that we can't not hire for, but what we're trying to do is, as we have vacancies, to be very strategic in how we approach them, and can we restructure certain areas. So yes, I agree with your point.
Yeah, and I agree this is a principle, not an ironclad rule, and it sounds like you're using it appropriately. On a different topic, back to the presentation, the enterprise funds operating at a significant loss jumps right out. And I'm of the opinion that whatever needs to be done to raise water and sewer rates such that they cover the costs, should have been done sooner and needs to be done now. I know, the pitchforks come out and people get all pissed off when you add $10 to their sewer bill. But yeah, so it's the enterprise funds, or 5.5 million loss in 2021, 3.7 million in 21-22. Those are huge numbers, if I'm understanding them correctly.
If I could jump in. So
please.
The enterprise funds here represent both the operating day-to-day as well as the capital. And so we did do water and wastewater studies in anticipation of some very significant capital projects. And so this is a planned use of funds. And so we do have funds that are set aside for some of these projects. So for instance, on the sewer side, our I&I projects, we have our sewer expansion with Gilroy. And so this just is a snapshot of what's coming in and what's going out. So we do have reserves that are set aside to cover these, if that sort of makes sense.
And
okay, well, so I mean,
so we have rates in place right now to cover the costs and to cover the capital projects.
So, Christine,
so let's see, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Christina, this is Rick.
Yeah.
So it's fair to say that that enterprise fund balance already has these funds mostly available or will be available as people pay their bills.
Yes, yes, exactly. Now we will look to borrow funds in the future, but yet once again, our rates do cover that. And I would also point out that if you see that use of reserve / fund balance row, that's where that's sort of addressed. So we're pulling down on our capital funds that are set aside for our enterprise funds.
Do we have
Christina.
a more detailed slide about the enterprise fund?
I don't believe we do. Chris, I think I heard you wanting to talk.
Yeah, if I could just make one comment, we have some mandate. The biggest impact on that, John and Rick, is we have some mandated repairs we need to make across the city. So we've been told we have to do this, and it's pretty similar to things everywhere. So when we developed the rate increase that we did, we spread out that rate increase over a number of years, so it's not hitting everyone at 1 year. But that plan is included, as well as the plan to fund those like mandatory repairs. So we looked at that. We've looked at that over the last 4 years as it's come up and made those changes. So we don't expect that we'll have to do, wastewater users are going to see those rates at 5% for next year and the following year increase. Water rates are staying at a CPI level, but those planned rates and adjustments that we've done in the past and have planned, that's what's covering those improvements. We did not want to raise the rates to a level to try and fund all those improvements at once, because that would hit people hard. So we spread it out, and as Christina mentioned, we would bond to make those improvements that we have to make and spread out the impact over a longer period.
And in normal times, we even had in the general fund a planned spend down of reserves. And so there were years that we said, okay, let's put money towards our pension trust fund. Let's put additional money towards our streets. And so then you see the use is higher than they would have normally been. Okay, back to you, John. I think you may have more.
Thank you. That's helpful. So maybe then I'll shift to the communications points. This is slide 4 of the presentation, right? And if you just read this slide and don't have all that verbal addition, it says, whoop, no, don't change. Stay where you were.
Oh, which slide? I'm sorry. This one?
The one we were just on that has the enterprise fund. It just says page 4 on the bottom.
Okay.
So this says it's page 4 on the bottom right corner. And what this says, if I just take this at face value, is that we have a $7 million, deficit for the year, 5.5 of which is because of the enterprise fund. If you just read this document as is, so if the purpose is to communicate, what's going on with the changes in the response to COVID, this leads to the question I asked, which then there's a long and complex answer to, which I understand the answer, but as a communication tool to the general public, there's a handful of us on this call. The other 45,000 people aren't going to have this conversation. So you might think about how to present the problem, in a more digestible manner, if that makes sense.
Well, in fact,
And then just the other.
so this is Rick again. I think one way to do that is purely to say use of general fund reserves as a separate line item, which might be 1.5 million or 2 million or something like that.
Yeah, so in this case, the use of general fund reserves is 3.8.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And just
okay.
For
and then the other just. Go ahead.
I'm saying just a quick question, just for clarity purposes, this slide does then represent the impact of COVID-19 for 2021, the 7.0? Is that right?
Yeah, so we've reflected in the general fund sources a revenue loss, and we've also reflected some expenditure reductions in the uses. So this is kind of where we're at right now, but this will look different when we come to the council on May 15th, as we bring forward additional budget expenditure reductions.
And if I could just remind everybody, this slide is all of the funds, not just the general fund. Right. And so that's an important distinction, because oftentimes we're just talking about the general fund, and
Understood. And then one more brief comment, and I'll let other people get in here. But looking at what you've presented, and that you're going to council with, more information, I think a rip the Band-Aid off scenario should be presented for them to really look at. And I would call that scenario all right, if we don't have any revenue increases, what is a likely scenario as far as where these reductions would come from? You wouldn't have 193 people still. I mean, so far you've proposed the low pain, the lowest pain kind of things that are still painful. But if that needs to be met with more dramatic cost-cutting measures, I think it's time to tell people what that might look like, painful as it would be. That's my comments. Thank you for the time.
Do we want to jump back and just look at those last few bullet points on the,
Maureen, I believe.
Maureen, I had a question.
Maureen has a
oh,
question.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go right there. You just had the slide up. Put the slide up for the reserves, please. I have a question. What happens when we go below the 15%? Is there some type of state law, federal law that, we have issues with?
Yeah, no, this is actually our city policy. And Dat, could you articulate both the 25% and the 15% line?
Sure. This is Dat. Good morning. So there's no state law to prevent us to go dip below any of the arbitrary policy reserve that the council set. So these are two lines, the 25% and the 50% are set by the council back in 2009. Back then, still very relevant today, is that the council states that the policy actually states that if any time the reserve drop below 25%, then the city need to come up with the plan and action to correct them, stay to remain above 25% in next budget cycle. If the line dips below the 15%, which is the minimum reserve level, then the city should formulate a plan within 30 days. I just want to reiterate the 30 days part because I think I make a misspoke in the last budget meeting. On Wednesday, I told the council was 9 days, but actually it was 30 days. The city need to come up with a plan to correct the line to move the reserve back to above 15% within 12 months.
Thank you, Dat.
Okay, there's no state law or anything that comes into play that about bankruptcy or anything of that sort?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Were there other questions about what Christina has gone through already?
If I may, this is that again. I try to elaborate our explanation answer to I believe it was Nick. Question about on the slides 4 whether the deficit of 7 million includes all the COVID impact. So the answer is no. We only make impact assumptions mostly to general fund and fund 206. Some of the impacts is not fully reflect in the other funds yet, like I would say capital improvement capital improvement funds, mostly funded by development impact fees, and we have not made assumption on those yet.
Dad, I appreciate the clarification because the math wasn't lining up. So I was trying to sync that up, and it's just so I think just a general point. You're right. I think as we present, if we're using this slide to present that, I think we're going to have to rethink the slide a little bit so it's clearly understood. Because it's real hard for the general community. It's very hard for me just trying to figure out how all this harmonizes itself over the course of the next 3 years. Mm-hmm. And when you have 2 or 3 slides that speak specifically just to that environment, it's hard to connect the whole. So,
right.
Maybe you can follow up with us about what mathematically you see that's not driving, because the numbers internally to this presentation of the budget should all match and tie up.
Right.
It's just we haven't showed and analyzed and finished our analysis on each of the different funds. So if we could follow up with you after, because I want to make sure that we address any questions that you have.
Okay.
Then we have, I believe, Charles also has a question.
Is there any study being done as to potential offsets that the state.
Charles, we're getting a lot of feedback. Maybe everybody can mute themselves.
Can't hear.
Try again, Charles.
Has there been any studies or guesstimates as to the amount of money that the state may be able to offset some of our deficits?
It was muffled, but I could hear the question. So basically the question is, are we aware of any offsets that will help us with our loss of revenue or increased expenditures? And the unfortunate answer right now is no. However, and do you mind muting, Charles? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Okay, so we don't have any revenue that we're anticipating coming in to help us because of the size of our city. So there's funding available primarily for cities that are bigger than 500,000 in population. And so we are advocating, lobbying, sending letters to our legislators, asking, pleading for funds that would come directly to Morgan Hill. And so unfortunately, that's not the case. And we have to rely on money that comes into the county and then gets dispersed out, which leaves us really nothing. And so we're hopeful that we can, get a direct allocation, but right now we don't have any specific funding.
I guess also to further that, the New York Times had an article about this very thing, states and cities getting funding or help from the federal government. And they basically said, well, McConnell said it's not going to happen. Other folks say it might happen, but the Fed is being looked to help in this situation. But again, they're looking at large cities over 500,000 in population. So Morgan Hill's kind of out of that picture at the moment. So that's an issue. I mean, I think we ought to push our politicians as much as possible.
Yeah, Rick, one more thing. Besides the 500,000, even there's a $50,000 mark for CDBG funds. And so even Gilroy, because they qualified for that mark, got, I think it's $275,000 in CARES Act funding. And we don't because we're just shy of 50. So it's very unfortunate.
And I guess a couple other comments. I'd reiterate John's comment about kind of a worst case scenario and have that in mind at least. Where would we cut? I think we can hope for a federal bailout. I think we can hope for a quick return of the economy. But, from my perspective, who's going to go back? Are we going to see restaurants full anytime soon? Are we going to see movie theaters full? I just don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think people are going to go back to buying big ticket items like cars or refrigerators, et cetera, or even do, home projects, remodel their house or anything. I think we need to be prepared for something that may even be 2 times the 2008 recession. And, that's big. I would ask a question of the FTEs. When we got down to 169, what was the biggest area or department impacted by that?
I'm going to go back to that chart here. So that was back in fiscal year 12. And, Chris?
I can, me and Maureen could probably help on that one. Since we lived through that time, as well as a few others. That also coincided with the elimination of redevelopment. So we lost pretty much all of our staff in redevelopment. For the years leading up to it, recreation was significantly reduced, and our park and street maintenance were significantly reduced in the number of people we had in those areas. So I think those were the biggest, as well as the I would say the admin side were the biggest. I know there were also some smaller reductions in police too. So it was across the board, but those were the bigger areas.
Okay, and then one other thing I think, John said the across the board thing we shouldn't do, I would respectfully disagree a bit. I'm sure there's places we can't cut. I like police. I'm sure there's some kind of union involved in a number of employees, but non-union, something like a 10% cut would be something I would put on the table. I know, just for example, some of the businesses I deal with, they've done 50% cuts for top executives, 30% cuts for director level, and 20% for managers. So they're getting brutal. Sorry, I don't mean to be Debbie Downer.
No, I think this is good, Rick. These are exactly this is the conversation we want to have. I think everybody's jotting down notes. I know I am. I can tell that Christina is, and so these are fair things to throw out there.
Yeah.
I would note, Rick, outside of management and our part-time teammates that are mostly furloughed right now with the recreation group, most of our employees are represented, but we do, and clearly identified management.
Yeah, I figured that was probably the case.
And maybe I'll just add a little bit to what Rick's saying. I mean, when I went through it again last night, as far as the full budget package, you know, trying to just get down to some fundamental issues that the community might see. So focusing just on the general funds. If I'm understanding this right, Christina, please make sure my logic or rationale is even close. But if you look at 2021, of the $42 million budgeted, 28.4 of that is deemed discretionary, right? So we've got only a section of those funds that we really can be considering as far as how we reallocate, redeploy, or do whatever we may do to make up that gap. Of the 28.4 million, it appears that based on the budget recommendations, 84% of that is going to maintain right public safety, fire, and police, which is about 23.8 million. So that leaves only about 4.5 million as far as discretionary dollars that really have to be spread out across the remaining departments and services, which the labor alone, as far as that discussion, whether it's furlough, whether it's the layoffs, whether it's a reduction in salaries, is certainly not going to compensate for that gap. So it's alarming. I mean, when you take a look at when the rubber hits the road from a general fund perspective, and then we add the drawdown of the reserves, we're in a fairly heightened exposure rate going into even the next 2 years, let alone projecting out over the next 5. But am I getting that right? I mean, if I'm looking at it, trying to speak to the community at large, I think there's where the focus is going to be. And I certainly recognize and would applaud, you're right, it's the right course of action to represent a big portion of what we can manage to maintain fire and safety and police. So those numbers are getting down to bare bones.
And I guess one other thing I might add is I know you're talking about a fee study for the development fees. I would think now is certainly not a time to raise development fees. I think we need to encourage the right kind of development in the city. And I know our fees have tended to be on the high side already. I think we need to encourage, again, the right type of development. So I would encourage us not to raise development fees.
Right.
And maybe if I could make one point, just jumping to, so when at the 50, 80%, remember.
Chris, you're breaking up, Chris.
Oh, sorry. Back.
Let's try it again. Yeah.
Put it in the chat.
Okay, he's going to put it in the chat.
Okay.
Maureen, do you want to see if there's any other questions while we await that?
I am seeing if there, yeah. Don't see anyone physically raising their hands. I don't see anybody raising hands through the Zoom. Okay. Is there anyone else who wanted to? I mean, this is exactly the kind of conversation we want to have. There are a few other slides.
I unmuted. Did you see it?
I didn't. I'm sorry, Doug. Go right ahead.
So I was going to bring this up later, but it seems that community members are making the kind of suggestions that I had wanted to see when the budget first came out. I made two suggestions to the council. One, which is somewhat echoed by some comments here, was that we ought to be looking at a range of scenarios, similar to the way MTC did with Plan Bay Area 2050. You know, an optimistic, a pessimistic, and a kind of more or less normal. But the other thing that I was interested in, and I think I'm going to ask the city manager to explain why she feels it was premature, because she's getting this kind of input today. And that was, if you look at the department write-ups, you would really not see much difference between 2 years ago and now. And what I had proposed was that the city has the knowledge to do some initial cost benefits, maybe grouping activities in tiers of a, you know, not too bad, a really bad, and something else. And that would give us the opportunity to begin to chew on things, as well as the council, because the council was told, you know, the real impacts we're going to present to you, you know, several weeks from now. And this is just a wasted opportunity to me. So, you know, maybe the city manager would like to explain why she wants to use the approach she recommended to the council, when clearly this group is telling her there are things, you know, that we believe we should be doing or thinking about. And I mean, that's why I wanted to participate today, because I think that's what we should be doing now. So anyway, that's my comment. Thank you.
I'd like to make a few remarks on that. So we will be bringing back some varying scenarios, you know, that have been talked about today. Doug brought up and was brought up at the council meeting, and we're planning to do that. You know, 12 million is our best guess at this point in time, but we're going to have more information, you know, each week, and we're going to be prepared to talk about, you know, what would, as I think Rick said, what would a doubling of that look like? And so as far as varying, you know, scenarios, what I had mentioned in my response to Doug that is part of the packet from last week as a supplement is that we're working on all sorts of different options, and we want to be very analytical, strategic in our approach. You know, some cities have gone out there and come up with some pretty, very, very dramatic reductions and starting to implement them. And I don't think that that is going to match up with our council's priorities nor with the community's priorities. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing forward budget reductions and being able to articulate what the real consequences are of certain budget reductions. You know, so anything that we start cutting out of the budget, there's going to be, in many cases, direct impacts or indirect impacts to the community. And so we want to be able to explain that and make that very clear about what it's going to mean to take, you know, if we have a reduction in police, what is that going to mean? How is the community going to feel that? You know, what programs and services is the police department providing that they won't be able to provide? Similarly, if we were to reduce our development services staff, what is that going to mean for, you know, when people come in and want to just sit down with us and talk about a proposed project? You know, we've been this customer service oriented entity for so long where we don't turn people away, we sit down with them, you know, and the community is going to feel the impacts of these cost reductions. And so we're working on all sorts of different options, you know, first and foremost, looking at what the council's priorities are and the community's priorities, and going from there and coming up with a lot of innovative ideas and wanting at the same time for the community to do that as well. And so that's how I would sort of respond to Doug's comments, and I encourage if any of my teammates want to add to what I just said in the process that we're embarking on, please do. And I see that Chris has unmuted his mic, so can I turn it over to Chris, please?
I would just echo everything you said, Christina, and just share that the people that are working on the budget, from what we anticipated to what we are now, have been working around the clock for basically 24 hours, 7 days a week. So to try and make those changes, the budget process itself, as we work into it, isn't like a 1 month process where we can easily change things. So I know, as Christina said, things are going to change through the process, but to try and get us there, get us to where we are, as you look at every narrative that Doug's looked at, he's correct. Those aren't all completely updated to the exact new reality because we haven't been able to do it. So it's just a matter of timing, but we'll get there.
Yeah, and the other thing, Chris, was that it? Yeah, okay, you muted. The other comment that I wanted to make is Doug's referring to the lead into the budget narrative. So as we talk about the division departments and what they're up to, and there's a lot of similar language from the last budget cycle, because some of what we do is sort of ongoing. And the budget, if we think about where we were at the beginning of March, let's just say, before the shelter in place, what we were bringing forward as a recommended budget was in many ways status quo. So we weren't bringing forward any enhancements because we knew that we didn't have the funds to do that we had to focus on just continuing what we're doing, not adding anything in addition, and continue the dialogue about how do we secure another ongoing revenue measure or adjust our budget such that we can take care of some of our unfunded needs. And so that's why a lot of that language is very similar. Anything else from the leadership teammates?
Christina, Joe Baranowski has his hand up.
Hey, Joe.
Morning. I have a few comments that kind of meld some of your comments that you just made and Rick Kent's last comments. I've always, since I started looking at this, had a lot of concern and questions about the Development Services Fund. In terms of the percentage of discretionary expenditures, it's a very large amount. I made this comment during the City Council meeting on Wednesday that I think it's misleading to show the $1.2 million deficit as being impacted by COVID, when at the peak of the economic boom last year, before any of this hit, that fund ran about $850K budget deficit. And this year, it was projected to run a $700 million deficit. And I also have a lot of concerns about the repayment plan. And more specifically, what I've heard in the past at the CAG budget original overview meeting and just now is that somehow, and this goes to Rick's comment about what the fee should be, is the real impact due to the guy off the street coming in and doing a kitchen remodel that you said were service oriented? Is that broken down more, or is this really the staff spending a lot of time with large projects, large developers like a Trammell Crow, where we know there was a vast amount of resources spent? When I reviewed the Shoe Palace project in detail, I saw just how fast the responses were and what staff resources were spent. So in my point of view, I don't agree that that impact fees are adequate. If developers want to come in and pay for that, we need to do a better job. I don't see a problem necessarily with charging residents for services. I do agree that when I walked into the department, I've got someone at the counter very quickly, and it's been wonderful. But to me, this is not only a large percentage of the discretionary amount, it's running a deficit. It was running a deficit way before this, and I don't understand why. I'd like to see a further breakdown of that, and I think it needs to be looked at more carefully for me to support any kind of budget decisions. That would be my comment, and I appreciate the time.
Yeah, Joe, thank you for your comment. So Joe brought the comment up also on Wednesday, and I think DAT's going to be sending me a chart that I'm going to share with you, Joe, and those that are interested. So The $1.2 million that we reference for development, the Development Services Fund, represents the approximate revenue loss for Fund 206. So it's not the net amount and what it's operating as a net loss when you take into account revenues and expenditures, but it's just literally a drop in revenues. Revenues go down 1.2 million. So we can show you that reconciliation to understand, you know, the different line items. Now, as far as development services go, so primary areas are planning, building, and engineering. And one of the main issues, it's not just, you know, customer service issues, but it's the sort of projects that we have to embark on that are in the Fund 206 program that aren't, there's not a fee associated with them. And so, you know, we're looking at, okay, do they even belong in that fund? We have another fund called Fund 207, which is long-term development, I think is the name of it. And so things like, you know, looking at things that we're required to do, you know, that were related to our general plan and the specific plans and that we can't charge fees for. And so that's above and beyond, you know, what you think about with planning, building, and engineering. And so those belong probably in the general fund. And so in this chart that you see here, that there is a line for development services, but there wasn't previously. You know, if you look at a snapshot of 1 year, so this just represents the general fund piece of development services. There's some cities that keep development services in their general fund, and so you never really see a net impact, you know, the net impact of expenditures exceeding revenues. But now we have it as a separate fund, and so this just shows the support that's going to be needed. And so we can break down the different types of projects and maybe provide a list of those even in advance of May 15th that hit the Development Services Fund that really don't make it feasible even in the future to not have general fund support. Okay, with that, any other, Dat wants to talk.
Yeah, if I could follow up with your comments on Joe on Fund 206 Development Services. Joe is correct that the Development Services Fund currently running a deficit even before the COVID-19 pandemic. That is mainly because as you go back to the January goal setting,
That is.
we presented. Hello? Can you hear me now?
Dat, you're sounding really garbled like Charles was sounding earlier.
Yeah, Dad, I would suggest you exit the Zoom and try and enter back in and see if it helps.
Go to different rooms, have a better Wi-Fi connection.
Okay, so he's
Or
going to
try and call in from your phone.
Maureen, do we have Chris's comment on chat?
Okay, does it better now?
No.
No.
Yeah. While we're waiting for Dat, can I just make another comment on the development services? I understand.
We can hear you.
Okay. I understand, Christina, there are some things that are buried in the development services funds that are the city's obligated to pursue. And I don't know if that's a certain percentage of that, but I do know that when I do not know the scope of the work of a project, I always will charge time and materials. And so I don't know how best to do this, but if I was to come in and do a kitchen remodel and ask you about it, I think it's fair to say that I should be charged $100 or $200 or a certain level of the expected costs of the construction to be allocated to this upfront. I don't really know, doing some research all the way up to doing a fairly large development like the one that Joe mentioned, the larger ones, that should be paying quite a bit of money up front for your services. So it's not probably a lot, but it is something that in a time of stress is, I think, important to develop. Thank you.
Yeah, all good points.
Hello? So better now?
No, Jack,
it's
go
not.
ahead and send me a message and I'll relay your comments, or you can do it in the chat feature, either way. And Maureen, do we have comments from Chris?
Yeah, we do. And I think Chris could speak to this if he wants, but what he was trying to say back when we were talking about the admin services fund, yes, there could be cuts there, but remember that admin services supports public safety, so there's, you couldn't take it to zero because that's human resources, finance, and you need something there to offer the support that even just, so like if you said cut everything and just leave public safety, well, there's a certain amount of support services and admin staff that has to be in place to even keep public safety up and running. Chris, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, and it's the city council, city clerk, and those things too. You can't just you can't cut them all.
Yeah, I was just going to add, it does include, the city attorney services, the city manager, and all the other council services, which require, a mandated items as well.
So
Christina,
we're continuing to look at the development services fund, and we'll have more information, and on that. But I do appreciate all the comments on it. I think Edith, did you just jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. In development services, not everything turns into a project, whether they're big or small. So a lot of the work that development services does is answering questions, whether it's the engineers or the planners, and people have questions. Residents may be looking at additions, developers may be looking at zoning, and a lot of that engagement does not necessarily turn into an application or not right away, and we don't have the ability to charge for that effort.
Okay, any other questions?
Respond to Edith's comments. Yeah, I agree that a lot of those projects do not come to fruition, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be charged to determine their own fate. And if someone comes in and wants to do this kitchen remodel again, and it's going to take a planner 15 or 20 minutes, it's going to take some research, perhaps it's even bigger, and that is a couple $100, that it may even be $1,000. And if you want, if that's part of your cost to consider improving on your property, is the initial upfront costs of getting the scope of work. And I think we should be charged for that. I don't know how the mechanism would work, but I think there is some validation to charge for it. Thank you.
And I guess I would add to that. I think I agree with Charles that it would be appropriate to charge a fee for residences and other kind of smaller projects to kind of carry their weight. I think that's appropriate. My comments about not raising development fees was really on the bigger ones. I think we need to encourage big development as long as it's the right kind of development.
I'm going to jump in and there's several people who are part of our community advisory group who haven't spoken at all, and maybe you don't have anything you wanted to jump in with, but I just would like to make sure that if there are people who are wanting to say something, that they have the opportunity. There's just a few who are sharing thoughts and ideas. And this is exactly what we want to do, is have the rest, basically the rest of the time. We're at about a little over an hour now. And so we have about an hour and 15 minutes left. And so I think that, if there's still conversation around thoughts and ideas on the budget, we should continue with this level of conversation. At some point we need to, kind of move into, so what does the community advisory group, what do you see your role in realizing kind of the gravity of where we're at, and also that there's really no likelihood that in this moment we're going to move forward with a revenue measure, which, you know, there was a lot of energy around that possibility. So I'm just throwing that out there. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in.
We have Caitlin with her hand raised.
Go ahead, Caitlin.
Thanks, Maureen. I just want to jump in and sort of echo something that Rick said in the beginning and that I said in the last, on our check-in on the 14th, and that is that I've seen from the last conversation we had before COVID to now, our greatest need being a long-term communication plan that interfaces more directly with the public. And while we're not interested in pursuing a revenue measure in November, I think that the election in March told us that people have an extreme distrust for government right now, and how government is spending their tax dollars. And I think that coming out of COVID, we have an even greater and immediate need to be having those conversations. And I don't mean my comments to be disparaging at all towards the efforts that you've done currently, and all of the outreach that you've done on social media and all of the town halls and all of the things that you're doing, which I think are fantastic. But I think that eventually, whether it's 2 years from now, eventually we're going to need to have some kind of revenue measure, and or clearly we're going to have to be making up revenue in some way. And so I still see the need for having a campaign, a communication campaign that I think partly comes from the community advisory group, but also I think is a retooling maybe of the way that the city is thinking about your communications plan, where I think we have to engage people right now in a more immediate way about what's coming down the pike and what kinds of services could get cut. I think that people need to see that as much as it feels like out here we're fighting for our lives, and I know that there are a lot of people on this call that have applied for PPP programs, my company included. I know John's company that didn't get the funds. So we're out here fighting for our quality of life. And I think the city needs to open up the conversation with people so that we can see the city is doing the same thing to try to build that trust up a little bit, so that when we're having the harder conversations down the road, that trust has already started to build back up. I'll let other people jump in.
I know Nancy Domnauer had her hand up as you started to speak. Nancy, did you still want to jump in?
Yes, it's great. Caitlin and I are aligned. I wanted to simply say that these charts are really detailed, and I think for the average citizen, they're a little bit too nebulous. I think we need to keep things really simple and support people at this time. And so I think opening up the communication, it's kind of like there's so much going on in the world right now, but they kind of need to know what's happening, what will be happening in their own town coming down the line. We're trying to deal with as individuals to stay healthy and as families, but then we need to know what's happening on our town level, because stuff coming nationally and from the state are kind of changing all the time. And anyway, but so I just think communicating with our people, kind of giving them like briefings of what's happening, what you guys are doing, what we're trying to do to keep quality of life would be a smart move to build up trust, as Caitlin said. And then because we're all going to be facing, new realities going forward. So that's what I wanted to say.
If I could jump in and ask, I agree with everything you're saying, but exactly what would that look like? everybody is dealing with a ton of information. We, the city, are pushing out a ton of information. I mean, part of it is because you just need to get the information out there. Part of it is because we know that people need it, and it's always the challenge. It's so hard to break it into a small sound bite, and in a way that's going to grab someone's attention and keep their attention, because we're so bombarded. And I mean, like, it was very exciting, the first town hall that we had, our virtual town hall, which I think was 3 weeks ago. I think we had about 130 people, which was like awesome and amazing. And I mean, we were all excited about it, and we had our entire leadership team online and there and present. And I mean, when you think about the simplicity of it, on one hand, because of the technology available, it was like, wow, that was great. And we got some good questions. We had everybody there who could jump in and answer. Wasn't a huge, resource time suck, if you will. That's probably not very appropriate language, but sorry, even the communicator can. Anyway,
but I think that's fair. I think that people on the outside can feel that way if it's too much information. I think that's a fair way to look at it, not for the people that are super involved all the time, but for the people that are new to being involved.
Right. And in the midst of this situation, so we've got a lot of information that needs to be shared out and available just in relation to, the shelter in place and all of that. And at the same time, we need to have these very solid discussions about the budget and make people aware. And some of it can be simplified, but I guess I'd really like to hear how can we have these, I mean, and how do you even grab, I mean, 130 people was great on a town hall, but in a population that's just under 50,000 people, that's that's nothing. It doesn't even have significance.
Yeah. So if I can just sort of flesh out a little bit more what I was thinking, what I was trying to get at is I don't think that I would take away anything that you've done. And I'm not saying that anything that you've done is unnecessary or wrong. I think that it's important for I'm going to pick on you, but for the people that want the level of detail that Doug Muirhead wants, they should have access to that information. And so I don't want to suggest that we stop giving the level of detail. That's still necessary. The town halls are still necessary. The budget workshops are still necessary. I see that on top of that, we need a PR campaign. And it may be that we need to hire a PR consultant that it's their project separate than your job, Maureen, of communicating all of the information, where we develop a campaign that's just around the future of Morgan Hill. What's the future of Morgan Hill look like? And to me, it's the same way that you run a campaign. So it's things like maybe we send postcards out that encourage people to go to a website where we have a survey where we say, when life gets back to normal, what kind of services do you see? What kind of services do you have that are you experiencing from Morgan Hill that you see as essential? Because we're going to need to cut things. And so people are giving you feedback as to what services they find most important or that they utilize the most in the city, just to get people starting to think about it. But when I talk about campaign, I mean, like as if you were running a campaign on, a proposition. So potentially branding and billboards and postcards and a website of information. And I see that partnering with the community advisory group and our communications plan as interfacing and providing more of the detail. When people ask questions or people want to get involved, then we now have more of the information at our fingertips and we can kind of interact. It's a huge undertaking, and I see it sort of as being I know that I'm talking about spending more money, but I see it as sort of if we don't get this right, this is the umbrella that's going to allow us to get the revenue and to get the funding to do everything else in the future. And I think that rather than looking from a purely city perspective, we have to look from the perspective of a PR and communications plan that's I see it as different as being what your job is, Maureen.
Sure, and I mean, please know, I'm not taking any of this personally at all. This is really valid and good discussion. And one of the challenges, I'll be honest, that we always come to when we think about, I mean, sure, there's plenty of PR firms out there that would love to get a hold of something like this and run with it. And all the things you're suggesting, and I would just a general guesstimate, it's probably to do something like that, more than 2 years worth of my entire budget. It's expensive to do campaigns like that. And I definitely understand the need for it. And it's one of those, it's almost a paradigm shift, because typically, and this has happened over and over certainly in government, you get rid of the communications team, I mean, and we did that. We did that the last time around. We really decreased resources in relation to how we could communicate out. And we were not alone. Many cities do that. So it is a paradigm shift to think in the midst of cutting, you're going to spend a whole lot more on something like that. But it's an interesting.
Well, and it could also, sorry to interrupt, but it could also be something like we hire a consultant just to get us going, and to get maybe the community advisory group can end up doing a lot of the work on the ground, but having somebody that sits and tells us, this is how you reach out to 44,000 people in a different way, just to get us on the right track. And maybe we can end up doing a lot of the legwork over time. But we do, I mean, we spend $40,000 for a consultant to talk to us about safe railroad crossings. And, we do have money. I've seen us in the budget spend money for consultant to tell us that the high-speed rail is right on their ideas of where the track should be. So I'm talking about maybe somebody that can come in and help us develop what that plan looks like, but then we take it and run with it.
Sure. And I would just suggest that anytime you bring a consultant in to develop a plan, and then you're anticipating that city staff will run with it, we also need to be cognizant of the fact we may have less city staff to run with anything so I see Nancy was raising her hand again.
Yes, thank you. I think people need short sound bites. The people's attention span is really, if you could give them just like a 1-minute update, a daily update, or just a 5-minute briefing, or just something to communicate. And I also think people work well with visual, like photos or graphics or pie charts, more than, intricate, spreadsheets and things like that. It's too hard to decipher. So those are some of my thoughts. Another one is that there are so many unknowns now. I think that if the city shows, can at least answer some, fears or confusion about what's happening now or what's going to happen down the road. If they can see that the city is already kind of thinking about what things might look like, would be, it puts confidence in people. So yeah, and I would money for that versus investing in our own community and just dealing with what we have. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Okay. I know we have some comments here that.
And Doug has his hand up.
Who does?
Doug.
Doug, go ahead.
Thank you. I want to follow up on Caitlin's comment And then Maureen's response. I think we're stuck in a rut of everything has to come top down from the city. I was thinking about this amazing list that you put out of all the NGOs and volunteers that are running food pantries and things to support residents, the work that the school district is doing with the Y and some other organizations on, you know, providing food and supplies to replace what they used to get at school. I was thinking about a comment the city manager made at when you had the meeting with the chamber, and she was asked about, you know, tracking domestic violence, and she said, oh, you know, Community Solutions does that. We have all these organizations that are currently in contact face to face at the individual level with our residents. And that to me seems to be the channel, one of the channels that we should be using, as well as thinking about how we used to use volunteers and Governor Newsom's, you know, California Service Corps, and begin to look at putting some options on the table for our residents that can and are able, you know, to participate and start using them and stop talking about spending money on consultants and formal communication plans and that sort of stuff. So I'm pretty amazed, I have to say, about what this community is doing down at the grassroots level that's really pretty invisible most of the time, and I only know some of it because the city did put out that list. So I think that is a way to do what Caitlin is recommending, because I'm a big proponent of a new communications approach, and maybe this is one way to try and solve that problem. Thank you.
I want to make sure that we get in the hands of this group specifically what you're referring to. So we have the list that I provided to the council by department. So I think maybe you're referring to that. And then we also have a spreadsheet that lists all the different resources in our city. Is it both of those or one of those?
I was thinking about the spreadsheet that you put out that listed the various food pantries and things.
Okay.
I mean, I also appreciated the teammates list that you put out and gave to the council to tell us, you know, what the city was doing in addition to just, you know, working with the business community. But the one I was referring to was the community asset one. Thank you.
Okay, Maureen, I'll send you the most updated one that you can share with this group after the call.
We have a couple of comments. Are you all able to see the chat? I don't know if you can see the chat or not. One of the comment, I know John had to jump off, was if you want an example of how to do communication, watch promo briefing. I'm really sorry that, oh, he had to go. So those are daily briefings. Obviously they're getting, he's a very charismatic human being, and you know, there's huge things happening in New York, so he's getting a lot of attention there. That's an interesting thought, to do daily briefings. We won't get the same media attention as Morgan Hill, but maybe we could figure out a way, like through podcasts or something, that people could have access to it. And then Sean Voss is sharing, my thoughts are that we don't need to spend money to have the people listen to the city. The city needs to listen to the wants and needs of the people. In the latter case, it would be the case that constituents aren't happy with the outlays and ways monies are being spent. The biggest pain point is lack of parks and open space and rapid development. The Shoe Palace, it's all over social media to be read and understood. You paid for a statistically valid survey that informed that constituents won't approve higher taxes. Okay. Actually, the last statistical survey we did indicated more of an interest than it ever has before, more support for taxes than before, but that was before we got to where we are today. Other comments, Doug's
Oh, sorry.
Is that Michelle?
Yeah, I was just gonna say Nick has had his hand up for a while.
Oh, thank you. I'm having a hard time seeing everybody's hands. I apologize. Nick?
Yeah, maybe, oh, can you hear me okay? Am I off mute?
Yep.
Okay, and maybe just to add some of the thoughts that have already been discussed in the last 20 minutes. I think it's essential that we take a look at what is mission critical and what's in front of us today, and how do we make that communication relevant to the greater community. And the grand challenge is how do you disseminate information to 48,000 individuals based on all that's on their plate, both professionally and personally. If I look at somewhat of the medical model, when these type of events occur, typically, right, command centers are set up, and there are daily huddles as it relates to the command center based on very specific scripting of what's important for that event to be disseminated across the medical community. I think we could do something very similar here, and we could start out potentially just with the budget process, because that is mission critical on how we're not only going to look to recover today and stabilize, but eventually how we're going to look for building some resiliency in the future. But I don't think I think to Caitlin's point, I think all of that is very true. But how do we scale it down based on the immediate need? And that's just one example of what either the city and or the CAG could look to do together, is put together some scripting for some daily huddles as far as very specific information that would be important to the community that could guide them either to further information or just a general understanding of what they need to be thinking about from a community perspective. That could be a videotape that's no more than 10 or 15 minutes long based on how you'd frame this, the structure out, but it would provide some consistent information that I think, to the last comment, we could disseminate to other groups as well that can further that network out. So it's just an opportunity to be able to take advantage of what we have in front of us today as far as a need, looking at not to potentially bring in other expenses to do that. We have the wherewithal based on, I think, what the city has already been doing to maybe structure a command center type of event where it's not as much a town hall, but it's here's the facts, here's the information, here's what you should be thinking about. And if that's done on a daily basis or every other day or whatever it turns out to be as far as the rhythm, that'll inform the city on what's important and what's happening today, whether it's budget, whether it's social services, whether it's shelter in place, et cetera. And that brainstorming can be done with this group to figure out what that scripting may look like as far as its templates, but that may be a very effective tool to be able to get to the grand challenge of information dissemination on a very rapid, from a very rapid perspective.
So if I could follow up on that, Nick, so what you're suggesting in a somewhat of a, and yes, we're very familiar with command centers and doing that. Right. Because we practice and rehearse for disasters on an ongoing basis. Right. Unfortunately, the pandemic situation was not anything any of us ever, practiced for. So, but anyway, so I get that idea. And in many ways, we have that going on within the city right now. Right. Because we're meeting almost daily just as our leadership team to kind of talk through the main points and what's going on. But you're suggesting that'd be very specific in terms of information that we would then share out with the community, and do it in a video format, which is certainly easily accomplished. And then am I hearing that you're suggesting rather than just pushing that out through our regular channels, we would push it out to all of you to help push it out to all of your connections? Is that what I'm getting?
Well, it's just a thought. How do you connect and cascade that greater network, right? So certainly you would represent it as far as on the community website, but there are other groups then that can help influence people to look at that based on their social circle. So it's just a thought and be able to way to cascade this out. And I think to Caitlin's point, what that may provide directly is we're rebuilding the trust that based on the information that you're getting on a daily basis, right? You're sharing that to the various community groups that really have that have relevance to what it means to them on a personal impact, and then what to do with that information once they digest that. So it's a thought. I mean, if there is ever an event for us to put a command center up in our local area, we're here. Right, and you guys are familiar with that. You know how to do it. You've got police and fire that do that all the time. So putting together a city structure around that environment makes sense to me. And whether it's just focused on the upcoming budget, whether it's focused on the general issues at hand, there can be different huddles that represent different venues if that's what's important. But it gives individuals a chance to say, you know, I'm really interested in the budget. I'm going to look at these daily huddles. I'm really interested in whatever it turns out to be. I'm going to be looking at that. It's just a way to begin that communication and trust factor. So we know as a community of what the information that you're getting and how you're translating that to the greater need. It's just a consideration.
Thank you, Nick. Do others have comments, questions in relation to that idea from Nick?
Jody McRoberts has her hand up.
Jody.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Do I sound all right? Am I coming through okay? Hello?
Jody, a little bit louder if you could.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is this better?
Yes.
Let me do something. I'm on a headset. Let me disconnect my headset. Better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So what I was going to say is I really like Nick's idea. I think we have some highly intelligent people in this group with a lot of gifts and abilities that we could work together. As he was talking, I'm thinking about how, especially with our social media that we have, you know, we don't know until we give it a try to really begin to utilize the gifts in this group and the abilities, you know, so that the city can, I know the goal has been for the group to be, Maureen, you kind of put in the terms of basically independent of the city, even though we're getting information from you. So let's say we begin to do like what Nick's talking about, a command center just as far as communication. And what if we give a try to do YouTube videos? Maybe they're 2 to 3 minutes long, maybe max 5, and they wouldn't have to be every day. And if we get this, that idea out and spread the word to the different groups and connections, like with the NGOs, et cetera, and let people know that out there, they might say, oh, look, here's a new update from the community advisory group or whatever the name that comes through. Yeah, hey, they're connected with the city. I trust them. They're giving a lot of good information. And if it's short, just a few minutes long, and maybe a couple times a week, then people can be more informed. And I think that that was a very valid way to do it, you know, so that we're actually, and I know it was kind of like obviously a huge bump in the road with the whole shelter in place and the pandemic, what we're dealing with, but now that we're farther along to it, we kind of know what's going on. So let's just go for it. I really like Nick's idea. I think we should just really start moving forward with the whole goal of this is to really reach out to the people in the city in the best way that we can.
Okay. Am I hearing that you're suggesting that this would be the CAG who's putting out these videos versus city staff?
You know, I think so. I mean, I think it could be a mix, but you know, I whatever, you know, for Maureen, what I kind of heard you saying, and correct me, I don't think it shouldn't be from the city necessarily, but if there's a sense that if maybe there's a little bit of distance from the city, so to speak, maybe people will listen better. I'm not opposed to having it even through the City of Morgan Hill's YouTube channel. YouTube is so big and so many people are familiar with that, that's why I mentioned YouTube.
Yep.
But if you feel like it would be better and if it would be more well received through like a separate YouTube channel, whatever's gonna be more well received, I think that's the route we should go.
Mm-hmm. If I could make one comment, this is Chris. Just as this discussion goes on, I think one thing that's really important consideration to think about, and we've heard this with the community advisory group, is if the city is funding a community engagement effort and it's funded by the city, even if it's really led by the CAG, the community and many community members perceive that as the city, and CAG is an arm of a city. So that needs to be considered as we go forward, and that's just, you know, we've heard that over and over. The other I think really important thing is to remember is in all this, we can't make people choose to participate. We can only outreach to the amount of people that we want to that want to participate with the government, and there's just a big segment of the community, if you did a survey, would say, I don't want to hear anything at all. I just want you to keep things going, and I'm not going to communicate. And we just have to recognize that we aren't going to communicate to everyone. Obviously we can try and get to the biggest percentage as possible, but I don't think any city or anyone across the country has found a way to communicate to everyone.
Right.
Yeah.
Understood.
Thanks, Chris. Those are
We have, Maureen, we have Steve Tate and Brian Sullivan as well.
Okay. I think I don't know who was first. Who wants to go first?
I'd like
Steve's unmuted, it looks like.
Okay. I love the budget process. I love the amount of information that we get and everything about the budget. But I'm trying to think about how people really would react. What would they want to know? And so our budget is based on priorities. So I want to know the priorities. And then the other thing I want to know is what did I used to get that I'm not going to get now? And I think, we can put that together and communicate those things. And not only what am I not going to get now, but what are the alternatives of maybe doing something different to get those things? What are the opportunities that are presented by the whole process that we're going through? And get input as we go through that as well. So I think that could be a useful thing to incorporate in what Nick's kind of suggesting.
Brian? Brian and Jennifer both.
I'm there. Yeah, I think all these comments are great. One thing I've been thinking about is there's lots of organizations in Morgan Hill that have their own list that they send things out to. We should go after every single one of those organizations, whether it's WERC, whether it's Historical Society, whether it's a Downtown Association, whatever, there's so many different organizations that they have their own mailing list. Get their mailing list, send it to them, get everything sent out that way. You would reach more people that way than what we're doing today, I believe. The second question, kind of a question I have, is you sent out a survey yesterday, I believe, or maybe Thursday, and I'm wondering what the response of that survey has been, and I'd like to hear about the response that we get by the May 15th date, because that's going to tell us at least what some people are thinking. Not everybody, because everybody won't answer it. But I thought it was very good to bring that out, Maureen, and I want to thank you for that. Hopefully we'll get a lot of answers through that survey. All these are great ideas. We just got to get the word out. The other thing is, from a city standpoint, it might be good to have the mayor and the city manager do an outreach through the paper and then do a Channel 17 meeting saying, hey, here's where we're at, people. Just be right down to earth. Here's where we are. Here's the good. Here's the bad. Here's what could really be bad. And we're looking for input from you, so please get back to us as soon as possible, because we got to make a decision. And that decision is going to be based on the input we get back from the citizens. And if you do that, I think that's a number of different ways we can get out to people. Because, I mean, my neighbors, they don't respond. They're not involved. They're busy working. Now they're at home hunkering down. So maybe looking at Channel 17 for a half-hour meeting with the mayor and the city manager, going through the budget really quickly and say, hey, here's the things that we have to cut. Here's the things that we're looking. Here's the dire things that if things get worse, this is what we got to do, people. Thank you for my comments.
Jennifer was, I think, next.
Thank you. I want to go back to, I agree with most everything except Caitlin. I'm sorry, I don't agree with hiring a consultant. I think if word got out, and it would immediately, that we hired a consultant, everybody would immediately stop listening, because we're talking about budget cuts and yet we're not cutting those kinds of things. When John talked about the slides and what the information that comes along with it, I think that's very important for what goes out to the public. Those slides are great if you are knee deep in the process, but if you don't understand, like myself, the extra information was very helpful. The idea that people don't trust the government, okay, I get that. But then when you find out that the general fund budget doesn't reflect the reserves and other reserve, the 206 and all of those kinds of things, that we need to be able to have a slide that shows everything, not just the general fund. I don't know how you would structure that because I don't do slides, but that's the one thing. And then I wanted to get back to what happened to the software, the budget software that we were going to put out for people to actually play with numbers so that they could see, to Steve's point, what I have now, what am I giving up? And I thought that software was a great idea. And nobody's talked about that today, so I don't know where that is. And Brian, I agree with your resourcing all of the aid company, nonprofits and whatnot that are in the community, but rather than mailing, I would suggest that we get into their newsletters if they allow us to write something. And if we're doing a command center kind of briefing, that we give those links so that they can watch them. I think all the mailings go out with a newsletter, so rather than us duplicating the cost, we could just do it that way. I would recommend not channel 17 because not everybody uses cable. And I would say going live like we are today on Facebook is a much better way to get the word out. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Okay. Did I see, I think Charles, oh, Kathy, you haven't said anything. Kathy, did you want to jump in?
Yes. Sitting here trying to digest all of this, one of the things that comes to my mind is, and maybe this is a potential campaign, we're all feeling the pain from this. And it sort of sounds negative, but I think acknowledging to the community the pain that our residents are feeling, our businesses are feeling, and the city is feeling. And I don't know, maybe collecting that. But then this campaign starting to deal with the realities of those things, what the losses are we're going to have to suffer and what the alternatives are. So I agree with Caitlin pretty much. Again, I don't think with Jennifer's comments that going out and hiring a consultant at this point in time wouldn't work. I think down the road, a year or 2 years from now, maybe the community will be in a position where, looking at how we all share in solving this problem, we do come up with some kind of a ballot measure for increasing revenue. So, but I think that's long term, certainly nothing we could look at now. But what keeps coming back to my head is acknowledging the pain that we're all feeling, the situations that we're all in, and how do we work our way through that? I think it's a good opportunity for the city to, again, take a leadership role. You guys do a great job, Maureen, your communications and the entire city staff are great. It's just trying to focus it and reach the right people. Again, there are a few people listening, and those people who don't listen don't get it in a lot of cases. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that Sally had her hand up, and Sally hasn't had a chance to speak yet. I know Charles wants to jump in again. And then was it Shakib who also had his hand up? Why don't we let Sally go and then Shakib and then back to Charles?
And then Caitlin.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for recognizing me, and thank you for putting together this this forum, because I think it's very valuable. I want to kind of piggyback on Robin's suggestion. I really love the youthful suggestions. Just like so, my thought is the college graduates are coming back, and they have some fresh minds. They're eager to get some experience regarding economics. Not all, but some of them are now have their degrees. And I think that is a huge resource to tap into. They're, like I said, have fresh minds. They're the ones that are going to be owning Morgan Hill in the future. And I think piggybacking on Robin's suggestion about the process of utilizing this useful resource, maybe not having to pay, but the again, there could be internships that are volunteer based. So thank you for letting me comment on that.
Okay, Shakib.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. I don't know where this fits in. So I just, as we keep hearing that we're all in this together, I was just wondering, have we, or at a city level, reached out to cities that are similar in size to, in population with Morgan Hill, and see how they're handling their situation and things like that?
Yes, I would say probably many of us are in regular contact with cities throughout the county, both in relation to specifically, you know, budget issues and things, the COVID-19. Right now, we're all in a lot of calls every single day with people throughout the county, and then, you know, some of the leadership team in contact with people at the state. And so, yes, actually, I think that's one thing that maybe it's invisible to people out in the community, but we do a very good job of networking with other communities and sharing ideas and thoughts and resources.
Okay, thank you.
And then, and just to jump in on that, I think it may be valuable to share that infographic on the League of CA Cities. They did a fiscal impact survey in light of COVID, and cities that are of our size, ranging between, say, 25,000 to 50,000, 90% of those cities have indicated that looking to cut or decrease in public services in light of this. And then what I'll do is I'll send that over to Maureen, and we can disperse that back over out to you guys.
That's a good one. Thank you, Harjot. Ah, Christina just brought it up.
There it is.
Can I make a really quick comment?
Yeah.
Just real quick before one more person on the record says, I don't agree with Caitlin that we should hire someone. That was it. I am not, my only point was that I feel like what we're talking about is distinct from how the city has been communicating. And I don't necessarily think that we should spend money, or that's the only way to do this properly. And so I agree with sort of what Kathy was saying, and also Sally, that I think that we have to be really honest about how traumatic this experience is for a lot of our community members. And we have a choice to either be in communication with our community about what life is going to look like on the other side of this, or we continue with business as usual. So I don't think we have to hire a consultant to get at the ends that I'm suggesting. There's a small group of us that had got together in a communications subcommittee, which we never really got an opportunity to present that information to the rest of you. That was something that we were supposed to do at this meeting, but that happened prior to COVID. But there was the small group of us that got together and said, look, we really need to have a top level communication plan. We developed some one-page guides of what we thought were information that the community would need. And so I think that we can do some of that on our end. I'm just suggesting that the job is bigger than just me trying to do it part-time with the support of Brian and Rick, that this is a really big deal. It's really large. And whether it means that we have to sort of crowdsource the work to get it done together, I think that it's going to be really important for the community to know going forward that it's a two-way conversation. We're no longer just trying to put out information, but we're also needing to get information back from the community, because we don't know yet how governments are going to need to respond to the trauma that people are experiencing now.
Thank you, Caitlin. Much appreciated. I know Charles was waiting. We've got a couple of comments on the chat. Charles, do you want to jump in? And then I'd like to go to a couple of these comments on the chat.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think we're all kind of we're boiling down, I think, some of our conversations and suggestions. And one idea that I thought was important was to communicate that a positive attitude. I think it's real easy for a lot of our citizens, especially the ones that aren't participating, to become negative and spread that wildfire across the city. And I think in the long run, that's a detriment to our abilities to rebound. And in that light, I'd like to see the city council be more active in participating in that, and that they should have more time to dialogue. I don't know if it's through Zoom. I don't know how it is, but I have not seen a great deal of the city council, except for Renee, talk about how wonderful a place we live, and to remind everyone of all the wonderful things that do occur in Morgan Hill and won't change. And there's a lot that actually is better now in an odd sense than there has been, that was before we entered into this stay-at-home kind of situation we find ourselves in. And so I'd like to see more leadership from our city council and communicating not only positive, perhaps deal with individual difficult situations, difficult conversations, and not have it just become the city of Morgan Hill. We have elected these people, the council people, to become our leaders. And personally, I don't think I see that in a time when we're desperately trying to figure this financial crisis out. And so that's my comment. Thank you.
Maureen, if I could just jump in, I just want to kind of share some of the ways in which the council has been engaging and making sure that this group is aware of each of them. So Maureen embarked on a project for each of the council members, as well as the leadership teammates, to provide little videos as soon as COVID-19 shelter in place started. And so we have those posted on our website, and she has shared those in each of our 411. So each of the council members have sent out a video. I have Don Larkin, our city attorney, Chief Palsgrove, and I think we have a few more to come. So that's one way in which we started initially connecting. And then in addition to that, the council signed, each of the members of the council signed a letter that went out to the community that has run in a couple of the different newspapers. Maureen, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I mean, just we published it in the newspaper, we sent it out through our communication channels, through social media.
And then the mayor is joined the chambers, one of their Zoom meetings last week. So it was kind of a Q&A with the mayor. And then next Saturday, so a week from today, the mayor is doing Coffee with the Mayor virtually, of course. And so Maureen's going to be advertising that in our 411 and other ways.
Yeah, I think one thing, if maybe I could jump in and right now with so much information in, I think someone mentioned this, I think Nancy mentioned this on the chat, there's a lot of leaders that we're seeing on television, and it's so easy to turn on the TV and you hear from the mayor of San Jose all the time. He's in the news, he's getting coverage. We don't have a way to get that TV coverage here in Morgan Hill. So even if our leaders are sharing things, we can't get the media down here for a press conference. We can't get, I mean, we don't rate in the bigger TV media. So that is a little bit difficult when you're seeing, you know, the city just above us is getting all this press coverage all the time regularly. And we've shared out videos, and it's, you know, we probably can have more of them coming. The other thing to remember is we have a part-time council. They have jobs, and we're not paying them to be full-time employees at all. We're really, they get a very small stipend, which is also, just comparing to San Jose, very different. And so sometimes, you know, I'm just throwing out those as pieces of information that are also part of the picture. They are our leaders. We elected them. We also have to recognize we have part-time leaders as our elected officials. And that is very different from some larger communities that have full-time paid leaders who have their own staff. Our city council does not have any staff. The broader staff, you know, try to support the city council, but they do not have their own separate individual staff.
Well, I tend to
Other than me and the city attorney.
Well, yes, true. The city attorney and the city manager. Go ahead.
I tend to think that that when we're in a crisis, we act as leaders differently than we do when we're on a normal course of an expected lifestyle. And I don't think it's fair for you to have said that to not expect more than what we have essentially, I don't know if it's paid for or voted for, but I think the ways that you communicated, the one in the paper, I think, and the one, and that's the only one I've really seen. I'm not sure if I've seen others, but maybe that's just because I've just been distracted. But I think putting something in the paper is not connecting with the city as if we are like we're connecting now. We're connecting really in a difficult, and you know, I'm trying to keep the words that I say in a way that is constructive, and it's really hard for me. I'm much more graphically oriented, and I'm more blunt, and I don't specifically think sometimes I am good in a situation like this, but I think the city council is, and I don't, perhaps it's because I don't understand Zoom as well as I should, that we can't have Zoom meetings at 7:30 in the evenings when everyone has settled down from their day-to-day convoluted schedules, and they can concentrate on listening to the city manager or the city council, one or all, talk about difficult issues and try to articulate and learn from people that can connect at a time when it's more convenient for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. We've got Nick who's raising his hand again, and then I'm just gonna do a time check. We're at 11:04. Is there a need for the group to get a little more formal about where they want to go with this? Just putting that out there. Go ahead, Nick.
Just a quick comment based on the last couple of comments, and I do agree. First, out of full respect for what everyone is doing in the city and the roles you've taken. If I go back to kind of that command center perspective, right? During times of emergencies, even in command centers, although there are some very natural roles where key leaders play in a command center because of their expertise, typically what you look for, what I would look for, are the skills and the competencies for redeployment during those times of need to be able to spread out leadership in areas that they may not directly account for today, but certainly have the skills and the knowledge to be able to redeploy their efforts in different areas. So I'm only suggesting that if you decide that is a workable model, that you take a look at your collective team within the city and make some really hard decisions on skills and leadership, be it a city council member or a staff member, that can take up a new venues for the emergency situation at hand to be able to spread out the resources to effectively get action done. And that's really what's required at this point. You're absolutely right. We have to take some immediate action based on the immediate response needs today. At the same time, we have to strategically think about how we stabilize and how we renew. So it requires city leadership as well as community leadership to understand that all of our roles will change and have to adjust. So what we look for are those skills and capabilities that people can pull together as a coalition and put that in motion under a leadership direction. So that's just a consideration on one way we can be thinking about more where we need to go short term, say over the next 2 months, and then how that can be then scaled out or decompressed based on obviously the environment changing. But I think you're absolutely right. We need to be thinking about not only the immediate needs as it relates to the deficits or the negative exposures that we're dealing with, but we have a tremendous greater good happening in our community today that needs to be obviously exploded out so more people hear about that as well. And this is the perfect opportunity to be rethinking things based on the opportunity potentially for shelter in place to start to be relieved. But more importantly, then how do we put an infrastructure underneath that understands stabilization and then renewal? So that just some maybe final thoughts that I wanted to share just based on hearing the collective conversation today.
Thank you, Nick. I see Jennifer up there. Jennifer?
I agree with Nick, and I think, Maureen, you're right. We need to talk about going forward. And I think going forward right now to me means we grab onto what Charles has been talking about, whether it's Zoom or Facebook. I mean, Facebook is probably the easier way to go to reach a lot of people. Have the mayor talk about not just hang in there, we're all in this together kind of talk, but really what the city council is now looking at to try to get us back into a better place, and talking about those things very specifically, like bullet points, not a lot of rhetoric, but just plain language. And then not only have the city council do those kinds of things, but Christine and Chris and Maureen and you, and then some of us from the group talk about how we're working as community members, as volunteers, to try to make this work better in the long run and the 2-year time frame that we seem to be looking at, and what our interpretations are, so that the people out there that are watching us on Facebook can understand that we are a group of varied people with a lot of different opinions, and we're going to try to mesh to make things really work for the city and therefore work for the residents in that city. So as far as planning on where we go, I think that is one of our biggest communication avenues right now. Thank Carry
you,
on,
Jennifer.
Maureen.
Thank you. Sean Voss has jumped in and provided a few comments in the chat. I don't know, Sean, if you're willing to jump on with but you talked one about something in Nextdoor, and I'm not sure I'm completely familiar with what you're talking about. And then you said, what about the distribution of the Zoom links?
I'd be happy to explain. So on the top one, there was a ton of discussion about how do we engage with the community, and it's difficult, especially as everybody's sheltering at home. And I just happened to come across in some of the business publications that I'm subscribed to that Nextdoor bought somebody called Neighborland. If you go just to the click on that link, you'll see that it's specifically around community engagement. It seems to be directly addressing the problem that everybody was saying that we were having. Secondly, on the Zoom links, I think I'd love to get into a little bit more detail as to what the distribution strategy is. It seems kind of scattershot, and so are they advertised? Are they for the public to comment on or not? And Christina and I had a bit of a back and forth on this, and I just wanted to know if there is a strategy or if it just is kind of happenstance so far. Thank you.
If I could comment, and Michelle Bigelow, you can jump in. I don't think it's happenstance or haphazard how we're trying to distribute Zoom links. We have you unfortunately and several others were trying to get onto the council meeting this Wednesday, and unfortunately in our weekly 411, and I accept full responsibility for it, I had not copied over the new information for the meeting. That was simply a human error. In general, though, we've had the links distributed on Nextdoor through our email communications, which, by the way, we have about 28,000 now contacts in our email distribution, which is extremely high. And we also publish them out on, Facebook. So I think they're out there. And this last council meeting, and it was my mistake, we had a bad link for the Zoom meeting. To my knowledge, that's the first time that has occurred in the midst of doing the Zoom meetings. So yes, we do publish them, and we do want them to be available for the public to jump in and attend.
If I could just add one thing as an aside, Joe Baranowski brought to our attention that when we're doing the Zoom meetings now for council meetings, they're set up such that the council members and staff are panelists. And so the participants can't see who else is participating. So Michelle Bigelow is working with Zoom to see if we can make that a possibility so that participants can know who are the others in the virtual room. And so that we're working on. Michelle, do you want to add anything to what Maureen stated about how we're advertising the Zoom meetings?
I will just follow up on your last comment that I'm still waiting for Zoom to get back to me. I've emailed them twice. I'm sure in this era that they are swamped, as most virtual meeting software companies are. We have been sharing the links out. What we've done to kind of protect ourselves is we convert them to bit.lys, and we share out a bit.ly link in most cases. And we do this because hackers set up trolling software to look specifically for the word Zoom, and then they crash our meetings. They will take up bandwidth so that the public can't participate, or worse, they will put up very inappropriate videos or comment inappropriately. And we want this to be a productive and positive experience for everybody. So we're trying to balance how we protect everyone and still make it as accessible as possible. So we have been converting them to bit.lys. We have been sharing them on our social media, website, Nextdoor, email blasts. We will definitely look at it though and see if maybe we can prioritize them in some way. They are on the first page of the agenda. Like Maureen said, they're going out on all of our avenues. And so we'll just keep evaluating, if there's some way to move them up so that they're easier to find. But we are very actively sharing all that information.
That sounds great. Like, for example, the Facebook that this is being live streamed on, I don't think that it's bi-directional. I don't believe there's a link to the meeting in the Facebook.
Okay, that's a great suggestion. Yeah, thank you.
Very good suggestion. You're right. We probably have not done that. Okay, we are at 11:14. Here's what I'm going to throw out as a suggestion to kind of pull this together and come to, I think we could continue talking all day long because this is critical and there's so many thoughts and ideas. I have been taking detailed notes. I know a couple of other people have been taking detailed notes. A lot of good information and suggestions. I'm hearing loud and clear that what we're sharing out to the public, we need to simplify to the best possible extent so that it's easy to understand and you don't make assumptions because it's so complicated and it's not necessarily the right assumptions. It sounds like there are many of you who would be interested in being part of videos that we can share out. Videos are pretty easy to make with iPhones and so forth these days. So as long as we're not looking for extremely high quality videos with background music and editing and all of that, that it's a very simple thing to do. The city does have a YouTube channel, which actually has a ton of videos on it because our preschool is doing videos. And like I said, we've got the council member videos. We're going to have more leadership videos, and we can use that, or there could be a different video YouTube channel to drop videos into. Videos are very easy to share out on social media and in emails and things like that. And it sounds like there are many of you that would like to be part of doing that. So what we'll do is compile all the ideas that have come forth. We will get that back out to you quickly. I'm going to, make sure that we find out for sure again who is really interested in staying a little more heavily engaged in, making sure these things happen. And I guess I would just ask you to please stay engaged with us. And if the information that we share back out is missing something, if we've missed a detail that you felt was important, please let us know as soon as possible. Christina, do you have any closing remarks, or anyone else in the group?
I appreciate all the feedback and look forward to continued conversation. Our next opportunity with the community is going to be Thursday. Just reiterating, we are doing weekly town halls, and this one we're going to be focusing just on budget, and so that's going to be 5:30 on this coming Thursday. So I encourage you guys to participate in that, and we don't need to wait until the next scheduled Engage meeting to get feedback from this group. So please continue to reach out to us as we go through. Thank you.
Did I hear Doug's voice trying to jump in?
Yes, you did. Two quick comments. One, you're talking about your videos. Nobody spoke Spanish today, so I'm a little, I won't use the word concerned. I'm interested in how we're reaching out to non-English speakers.
Doug, if I could just interrupt real quick, we do have one of our teammates, Edith, as a matter of fact, that's putting out a Spanish video.
Okay. And the other comment having to do with the community budget meeting, your announcement only gave Zoom. It didn't give a phone in or any other access. I don't Zoom. I will not Zoom. So, if that's the only way to participate, then I won't participate. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Any other closing comments? Anyone else on the team? Oops, there's something in the chat. Oh, Jim Sergi is saying thank you to Doug. Okay.
Maureen, if I could just quickly jump in as well. I think one of the items that was brought up was by Jennifer Tate, the budgeting software tool and so forth.
Oh, yes. Thank you. I forgot about that.
A couple comments on that. Much like, our priorities here, things have changed. I think we were, prior to March, exploring having both sides of the equation. On the expense side, we had the unfunded needs that we were trying to solve for. And on the revenue side, we had some revenue measure options and so forth. So what's changed, I think, knowing that our unfunded needs are still unfunded now, in addition to that, we have these additional COVID fiscal impact challenge that we're trying to solve for. And on the revenue side, I think this group has given feedback, and as staff, we've kind of, come to a conclusion that a November revenue measure isn't likely going to be a recommendation. So I think that's what's kind of put the pause on that tool. However, we did supplement the survey that we sent out to try to get some feedback as far as, if the community has any ideas and so forth. So we'll continue to evaluate that once we have the scenarios that Christina's talked about. As staff's working on that, the situation is indeed still very fluid. So once those are available, we'll then reevaluate, what's the best tool to get that feedback from the community. Is it a polling, mechanism that we do through either Zoom, or is it a separate survey? Is it really the tool? If we could still use it just on the expense side, perhaps we're not trying to solve for the unfunded needs, but maybe, community gets a chance to weigh in on what some of those scenarios or adjustments that may be. So that's the comments along those, the software side. In addition to that, I would just encourage maybe, this group, after we get done with our meeting, to, maybe a challenge is to go ahead and, use your social media accounts to do a post, maybe a top 1, 2, or 3 things that are of importance to you coming out of this, that you can share with your constituents, your followers on your social media, and then promote the April 30th meeting. So we can have folks that are out there in the community that are not regular participants that are encouraged to join and ask those questions. And then I believe we have also put out the budget at morganhill.ca.gov email. So if there's any separate questions that are not either in the survey, or you have other comments or feedbacks on the document in itself, or city services and so forth. So we really encourage folks to communicate that out as well.
And thank you so much, Harjot. If I could follow up on that. I did jump on to our survey. Only 26 people right now have taken the survey about next week's budget. And we'll be pushing it out on social media as well, but I will directly send that link to all of you, and you can push that up as well, because we really wanted to hear from the community, what will help make this the most productive meeting. We hope that all of you will participate with us on the 30th at 5:30. And Caitlin was asking, when is our next meeting? In this moment, we actually don't have an official next meeting. We hope that you'll participate on the 30th. We hope that you will be part of the council budget workshop, which is on the 15th of May. And the time that we would normally have another meeting is Saturday the 23rd, which is part of Memorial Day weekend, which in this moment, I don't know for sure. We may all still be in shelter in place. And maybe the 23rd would be a workable Saturday. I don't know. It probably wouldn't. We probably wouldn't hold the meeting that Saturday if we were in regular times. It would be good to have a follow-up after the budget workshop, though, with this group, because between now and that point, I think there's going to be a lot of activity. We, the city side of the equation, are going to be continuing to work hard on different scenarios and possibilities, which are for budget reductions. And so unless you want to meet sooner, I don't know, shall I send out a poll and see how the 23rd works for everybody? Yeah, just give me a thumbs up if that sounds like a, okay.
The only thing I'll say is that if things change, it's hard to predict if things are going to change or not. So if it works for us now, it might not work for us in the future.
Right. Isn't that the way? I mean, it's such a challenging time, because day to day we're finding out new information and things change. So, well, and let's put it this way. I guess if we have shelter in place, would people be able to do the 23rd? Put your thumbs up. Okay, so it sounds like that. So you know what I'm going to say? We'll tentatively plan for the 23rd as a 9 to 11:30 meeting following our normal schedule. And if things change, I seriously can't believe that we're going to be open for traveling and family barbecues and friend barbecues and things like that by that weekend, but you never know.
Maureen, if I could just jump in, and just as it relates to timing, I received an email from the county last night, and I'll just read just very briefly, what their thoughts are. And they say, as we are a little more than a week away from the end of the current shelter-in-place order, many of you are obviously eager to hear what comes next. The Public Health Department is right now poring over data to determine what comes next, and we will share news of that decision as soon as we are able. Be assured, though, that what comes next will not be a radical departure from our current intervention. And then they go on to talk about what 6 indicators they're looking for.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, so we'll plan on the 23rd at 9 a.m. as our next formal community advisory group meeting. Before then, I think there'll be a lot of information back and forth. If you have feedback, comments, thoughts, ideas after this discussion, please feel free to send them my way. I thought this was a good, healthy discussion. It's a tough discussion. And I think you've provided us with a lot of good information to organize and, you know, share back out with you to make sure we've got it, and then start moving forward with some. So don't be surprised if you're hearing from me like, okay, we're ready for your video. Yes, Brian.
The chief has been very patient, not saying anything. Perhaps we could get an update from the chief on how things are going with both the fire and the police, EMS.
There's Chief Palsgrove.
Hi, Brian. Can you repeat your question? I had just ran out of the room.
Yeah, if you could maybe just.
Oh, you're muted, Brian.
Sorry, I got muted again. Yeah, if you could just give us maybe a quick update on how the things are going at the police department, fire department, EMS, and how things are going generally in the city from your viewpoint.
Yeah, that's a loaded question. Overall, regarding the COVID, we've responded to over 155 complaints. We haven't issued any citations or made any arrests. By and large, the community is abiding by the order and doing their part and reducing the spread of COVID-19. So as all of you know, we have a very supportive community, and that is making our jobs a lot easier. Regarding crime, over the first 2 weeks, we were able to scale back some of our resources to make sure that we had officers or teams to go in and replace patrol officer teams that may have been exposed. Over the past 2 weeks, we've seen an increase in crime. We're contributing some of that to the jail systems, pushing low-level offenders back out onto the streets. The jails are 29% below capacity because they're pushing people out that have to prevent an outbreak in the jails. And so we're seeing a lot of recidivism. We're seeing a lot of property crimes uptick, and our patrol officers are now really busy. We've pulled back those teams, the reserve teams, and they're now back on the streets. We've had a pursuit last night. We had another pursuit this morning from a hotel. So as far as crime is going, we're really paying attention to that, and it's challenging for the law enforcement right now, as they're doing great jobs putting together some great cases, but they're seeing that the criminals are just being released from jail within 24 hours because of the bail schedule's been reduced. And so with that said, Morgan Hill's still not seeing as much crime as other jurisdictions, but we are seeing an increase. And then regarding mail theft, we have stimulus checks coming out this week. And so I think the crooks are catching on to that and hitting mailboxes and looking for those checks. And so we've had half a dozen community mailboxes broken into. However, that's not as bad as other jurisdictions, because in other jurisdictions, they're not going after the community mailboxes, they're going after the mail trucks that have thousands and thousands of mail inside and actually stealing those. So I think that's a snapshot. And are there any questions?
No, I'd just like to give a good shout out to the team and to all of our first responders. Just doing a great job, and thank you very much for your service.
No, thank you.
Thanks so much. It is just about, actually it is just 11:30. So in respect for everybody's time, I'm going to go ahead and suggest that we close our meeting. Appreciate everyone being here and taking this solid 2.5 hours. So thank you so much. I hope you have a chance to get outside today, get some fresh air, enjoy our beautiful weather. And again, please reach out if you have any other thoughts and ideas that, you know, we didn't get a chance to get to today. It seems like we had a pretty thorough and robust conversation, and we will be transcribing this and getting back to you and organizing a more official plan as a way to move forward, and would like your input on that as we send that. And thank you so much for the command center idea, Nick. And I guess that's it. Yes, stay healthy. Someone's saying stay healthy. Yes, stay healthy. Goodbye, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend.
Goodbye.